All right, folks, I'll tell you what, it's an exciting war. It's a fascinating war. It's got all of life in it. It's got heartbreak. It's got success. It's got failure. It's got all the things that make life interesting. That's why so many people are obsessed with studying the Civil War. So my job is to try to give you enough information to where everybody here finds something interesting about the Civil War, because there's something for everybody in this incredible, tragic, historic event. Uh, you are going to have a notes sheet, even if this is not your personal project, or sorry, even if this is not your U.S. history class, you will have something called a notes sheet. Unit 6, U.S. Civil War. And that note sheet is where you're going to be jotting down the information that I'm going to be giving you today. Today, my goal is simply to just kind of set the table, right? Just to kind of get some basic introductions done on the U.S. Civil War, so then we can kind of get into the more detailed stuff. So we'll start with the basic details. I need to do a better job as a teacher of making sure you understand how dates fit together, right? So the U.S. Civil War takes place just after Lincoln gets elected in 1861. And it goes to 1865. It's a long slog of a war. These two maps I like because what you're seeing here are before the Civil War. You can see that America still hasn't finished its, quote unquote, manifest destiny, moving west. There's still a lot of territories that haven't decided how they're going to be formed into states. But California and Oregon, because of the gold rush, are already out there. And then this, you see the map of the split. And the yellow states are the 11 states who left or tried to leave the United States of America. We'll call them the Confederate States or the rebel states or the southern states. These border states, we'll talk more about those in just a minute, or actually at the end here. So they are blue, but a different kind of blue, and we'll talk about why. Main point is Civil War takes place 1861 to 1865. No surprise here. The Union or the United States won the Civil War. I just do that to get to our point that this isn't so much about the details of who did what when. This is about the big impact of the whole war on the U.S. psyche, which is why it's still a big deal today. So the war begins with two big questions. The first big question was, would President Lincoln end slavery, which you read about in his inaugural address, right? Lincoln was elected president as a member of the Republican Party. Now, Republicans were kind of this compromise party. They were a brand new party, and they wanted to bring together people who didn't like slavery and people who were maybe okay with it. And kind of the compromise that the Republican Party came up with was they were against the spread of slavery into new territories. What that meant was they said, hey, if you have a slave, that's your business, right? But if we're going to go back to the map and see all these new territories, here, the Republicans said there should be no new slavery, right? Their idea was if you just let slavery only in the South, eventually it would kind of just die out. That was the plan of many Republicans. So Lincoln was elected. He was the first Republican ever elected. And the Republican Party was not against slavery. They said you can have slaves, you just can't bring them with you if you move to a new territory. Lincoln told the South that he would not interfere with slavery in the South. He went so far as to say, and you read about that in his inaugural address, it's illegal for me to do that. He didn't believe, because he was trained as a lawyer, he thought it would be illegal for the president to say, I end slavery everywhere. So he looked at the South and he said, listen, this is what I believe. I don't think we should spread slavery, but I will not mess with slavery in the South. But the South didn't trust Lincoln. After Lincoln was elected, these 10 states, and then later 11, ceded from the United States of America to form the Confederate States of America in order to protect their peculiar institution, which we listened to in that clip from the colonel, who is the historian at West Point. We are leaving in order to protect our peculiar institution, which they said was slavery. That we have this unique thing, this special thing called slavery, and we are going to start our own country in order to protect it. They feared that Lincoln would interfere with it. So that's why every state that ceded, every single state that left to form the Confederate States of America, all cited slavery in their document that said they were leaving. So the idea that the South didn't start worrying about the Civil War, didn't start fighting because of slavery, that's just false. Anybody that tries to tell you otherwise doesn't have the whole story. And we can look and see that the states at the time said, we're leaving to protect slavery. The other big question is, Can they do that? Is that even something a state can do? Can you just leave? Right? You can see Lincoln here is going to agree with Lady Gaga. He does not agree with that. Lincoln says it's illegal for states to leave the United States. He almost has to do that when you think about it as a president, because if states can leave when they don't agree with the national or federal government, eventually every state at some point is going to disagree with what the national or federal government does. Then the United States is going to fall apart. It can't be something that you leave when you don't like it. On top of that, of course, Lincoln's upset because he doesn't even want to do, and slavery, what the South is afraid of. The Confederate States of America say that they have a constitutional right to cede or leave. They say we are the next generation of George Washington. We, the people of the South, don't feel that our rights are being respected, just like George Washington and Alexander Hamilton didn't think Great Britain was respecting their rights, and so we're going to leave. Lincoln would turn around and say, what are you upset about? I haven't even done anything yet, and I promise that I'm not going to mess with slavery. So, the specifics of how the war actually started: there were Union troops at this fort in South Carolina called Fort Sumter. Even after South Carolina said, we secede from the United States, we're leaving, Lincoln didn't have the troops leave. Lincoln believed secession was illegal, so he refused to remove U.S. or Union troops from this base at Fort Sumter. He said, this is still part of the United States of America. These troops belong here. You're wrong. The Confederate States of America said, no, they can't be here because you are from an enemy army. You are from another country and you're in our country. So the Union was fired upon by the Confederate States of America in April of 1861. They didn't like it, and so it begins, the Civil War. The last thing, and I know this has been going on for about 7 minutes now, but the last thing that I need you to understand is this pretty confusing setup, right? So we just got done looking at this deal where the South admits that this is about slavery, and they put it in their documents. They say this is to protect our peculiar institution. But as you know, Lincoln turned around and said, this isn't about slavery. I don't want to end slavery. This is about the fact that y'all can't leave. You can't just leave. And it leads to these, what would you say, teal? I don't know, greenish blue colored states. They're called border states, right? And there were 4 states: Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. That's 5, so you can change that. There's 5 states, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 states, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, that had slavery but remained in the Union, in part because they did not agree with the idea of secession. So there were slaves here, slaves here, slaves here, slaves here, and they all fought for the Union. Not the slaves necessarily, although some did, but the states did, right? So this is muddy in the water, and you can see Mr. Mathers here is confused. You're right. The South says this is 100% about slavery. Lincoln says, I don't want to end slavery. You just can't leave. And they say we have to leave to defend our rights. So there's this really confusing, muddled start to the war. Is it about slavery? Isn't it about slavery? For the South, 100% it is. For the North, it's a lot more confusing. Some people in the North were like, absolutely, we need to free the slaves. This is our chance. Other people in the North were like, heck no, I want slaves. I live in Kentucky. I want to keep my slaves. But we can't just have states running off, starting their own countries. That doesn't make sense. So at the start of the war, depends on who you ask. If you talk to a Southerner, slavery is an issue. If you talk to somebody in the North, it's a little more muddled. They might say the issue is about slavery, or they might say the issue is just that the South can't just leave because that's against the law, and you can't just let states leave whenever they're upset. Meanwhile, Lincoln is giving his speech saying, if you want slaves, you can keep your slaves. I just think we need to stay together as a country. That's the best way to deal with it. So that's a brief start to the U.S. Civil War. And hopefully you are using this to fill in the notes. If you missed any notes, you can always rewind the tape. Thanks for listening.